Hey, welcome to Kotlin Conversations, where we're having conversations with just some of the amazing speakers here at Kotlin Conf 2025. I'm Quintuit Dow, and I'm speaking with
Alan Viverette.
and
Aurimas Liutikas.
guys, thank you so much for joining me. We'll start with you, Alan, and then you, Artemis. Who are you, and what do you do?
Yeah, let's see. I am an engineering manager at Google, and I've been working on Android for like 15 years now. First working on TalkBack, and then working on like Material One with Lollipop, and then support libraries, which then became Jetpack. And yeah, still helping lead the sort of AndroidX like development and release stuff, and thinking about APIs and how we manage that.
Cool. And I report to Alan, so he's my manager. I've joined right around the time when we had Android support libraries, and then I helped Alan to kind of make it into the Jetpack and AndroidX brand that we have today. So kind of working on infrastructure and Gradle bits and making sure everything is tested and works well. So that's the kind of stuff I do day to day.
Yeah, so number one, thank you for your contributions. As an Android developer, I'm very, very, very happy for all of your hard work. And I think part of like the story, especially as an Android developer and all like kind of like the evolution of Android in particular, like support libraries and Jetpack and Compose, has also been the role of Kotlin. And of course, we're at Kotlin Conf. So I don't know, like if you could just give me kind of like your impressions or your just like your perspective on kind of the role that Kotlin played in the work that you do on the support libraries in particular, or just in general for Android.
Yeah, I think we were just trying to dig through the like Git history and figure out when we introduced Kotlin, and it was like 7 years ago. And I think we introduced it initially because Yeetboyar really wanted to start moving the needle on writing libraries fully in Kotlin. Do you remember more of the circumstances?
I think we wanted to start it in a safe way where we don't just put Kotlin everywhere, despite it being very compatible. We were kind of like very cautious not to force something on people. So a lot of the things we started working on was the Kotlin extension libraries, the KTX libraries. So we kind of picked a couple of places where a lot of these extension functions would have been very, very helpful, and we just kind of started dropping it there. We're like lucky to have Jake at Google at the time to kind of help us really boost that to like a much bigger number of methods and helpers.
Yeah, I think a lot of our jobs is being very cautious about what we allow people to put into something like the AndroidX core library that every app has to use. So when we had the consideration of like, do we let people start using coroutines, we had to look at, okay, how much size is this going to add to every library and every APK that gets built? Because this ends up as a transitive dependency of everything. And at the time, like nobody was using Kotlin yet. And especially at Google, there's a lot of caution around making APKs bigger. So, you increase something by 3% and you get a bunch of bugs filed and like immediate reverbs against you. So we were very cautious pulling it in initially. But I had started writing tests in Kotlin, and it was just such a wonderful experience versus trying to write JUnit tests in Java that I was pretty convinced early on, and I think we've slowly brought everybody else on board. Or I think Yeet primarily pulled a lot of the weight for getting everybody else on board.
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest kind of the really diving into Kotlin and trying it out was a tool called MetaLava that we use for tracking APIs. The tool was originally written by Tor, who's a director at on DevX, and so he kind of wrote that code base, and I had to jump in and like contribute. And for me, that was kind of the experience and like learning Kotlin from just like jumping in on a code base I don't know and trying to add new features and do things there. I quite like it. I mean, now when I have to go back and like write some Java because there's some existing class that's there, I definitely struggle. The semicolons and imports not being quite right, and some of the functions just being harder to call, and just don't have the muscle memory for it anymore.
I literally, I just started a new job, and there's still quite a bit of Java code, important Java code, and I had that exact same experience, and I spent about 5 minutes forgetting that when you declare a variable, the type comes first, and it was an embarrassing long time before I figured out, oh, right, and also the semicolons. It took me about maybe 5 to 10 minutes to realize I hadn't put a semicolon, so... but thank you for all of your work to make that less of an occurrence these days and for giving me that problem, because I think overall it's been a really interesting transition. And I think it's always fascinating because, for example, I'm an application dev, always has been. And I feel like in my life, I've read so many articles or like had so many discussions with like senior and junior devs about what is it like when we write our APIs? But I think when we say it as kind of end user devs or application devs, we say it in a very different way than maybe you would say it. And maybe this is tapping into previous experiences before your work at Google, but I don't know, for you, what do you think are the biggest differences between the way you work as an API designer versus, like, we'll call it a regular old engineer making a product?
I think starting on Android was a really weird experience because working on a platform, especially a platform that effectively like is never going to break its APIs. You know, that Android deprecates APIs, and like for security reasons, we've maybe removed one or two. But once you write something that's a public API, like it's there forever.
Yeah.
And I didn't really understand early on quite the weight that carried and the amount of thought that really needed to go into sort of the high level design of something. Like I was working on themes and styles for Lollipop and sort of just adding whatever was necessary. But I think what became obvious a couple of years later, as you know, Chris Baines and I were giving endless themes and styles talks, was that we didn't take a step back, and to a certain extent we were locked into what was already there, but we didn't take a step back to say, okay, what makes sense as concepts for themes and styles, and then how do we make that work with the existing API surface? And that's because everything kind of locks in permanently.
Yeah.
You really have to think about that.
Yeah, I think to add to it, I think even for libraries, you know, like it's often kind of people kind of think about it, but you can change the library any way you want. And I think it's especially true if it's a library that's only used inside of your app, because, you know, you chase the API and then you update all the use sites and you're done.
Yeah.
But I think for something that we ship, we've kind of got to the point where people build libraries on top of our libraries, right?
Yeah.
So you go and find, you know, some really popular libraries out there, and they're building on AndroidX SQLite, or they're building on AndroidX Core, or even Compose, right? And all of these libraries now, we are kind of like, we have tiers of users, right? We have libraries writing libraries, we have people using the APIs directly, and like we have, you know, people building tools around these libraries. And so like all of these things just makes it that much more tricky to make sure that we do the thing that, you know, we can maintain it for forever. And so I think that was an interesting thing. And like even kind of like learning when to adopt new patterns and new things, and not to cause, you know, moving the cheese on people all the time. Like we really try not to do that, right? And so like we're trying to, you know, sometimes maybe too slow in adopting things, but like we try to make sure that it's kind of consistent, makes sense. And I think one of the things that Alan kind of like, as we were writing presentation for the Kotlin Conf, Alan put out there is like, you know, we want people to feel that all of the APIs from Google were written by one person, right? And it's like, how do you get there? And it's like such a different skill than, you know, having to like, oh, I wrote this little thing here for myself, I did this thing.
How do you even develop a process, or like, you know, for presumably you aren't just presumably you are two people sitting in front of me, and there isn't just one of you moving back and forth very quickly writing APIs. How do you, I guess, what's like the training or the process or that you do as a team to make that happen, to give that one person appearance?
So one of the things that we've built up over a couple of years. So when I joined Android, they were already doing a thing called API Council, where like Diane Hackborn and all of the like really high leveled Android engineers would sit in a room and just look at every single API that was being added to the Android SDK and comment on it and give feedback and ask for changes. And that has been difficult to scale, but we've effectively scaled that up to every API landing in the platform and also every library that ships under Jetpack. So we've got probably more than 200 people right now that are trained for what's effectively like API readability, that you have written enough APIs and reviewed enough APIs and understood the guidelines that we've built up over time, so that you can, as an individual, say, okay, yeah, this is good. And like, if we lock this in permanently forever, that's fine. We don't necessarily trust an individual 100%, so we then still also have like a cycle of a couple of people in a room, like we did in the early days of Android, still looking at these APIs. But that's one aspect of how we approach designing APIs. That's sort of the end stage.
And we also try to catch like some very basic things that we can in automated tooling. So, you know, like naming of methods in a certain order, or, you know, putting parameters in a way that users kind of expect, you know, having a lambda at the very end, so it's easy for people who are using Kotlin to just start using it without having to like pull it out and stuff. So like, I think some of that is like in tooling, but some of it is so hard to express because, you're using an API and it just feels wrong. And it's sometimes, really hard to put in words or why that is the case.
Yeah. And I'm sure you've gotten many like bug tracker or a comment about this doesn't feel right. I think is really one of the most impressive things to me as an Android developer the last few years is just kind of like also the adoption of KMP. And, as you were saying, like, kind of Kotlin started off with like KTX, which feels like a very useful, but also very light, like easy to commit kind of like step towards Kotlin. KMP feels like so much bigger, kind of like, obviously like almost like a fundamental change. Maybe can you talk a little bit as much as you can about the challenges of, bringing KMP into all of this?
Yeah. I think one thing that we are kind of like lucky is that a lot of the stuff we've been doing has been kind of in stages. So originally all of our libraries were Java. And, over time we kind of converted bits and pieces of it to Kotlin. And that kind of gave us a good starting point where, going to KMP, if you have a pure Kotlin library, it's actually a much easier, step than going from a Java library to a KMP. So I think we kind of had a process of like, okay, let's improve this for all Kotlin users, converting some of these libraries and making them, use suspend functions. And we're, kind of building kind of like, properties and accessors and like making it feel good. That was like a really good homework for us to get to KMP. Obviously, it doesn't solve all of the things where there's like Androidisms, right? If there's a context, like what do you do in a KMP setting where, on iOS, there's no such thing as context exactly. So I think that caused a lot of kind of thought and see like, do we need to rethink some of our libraries and like structure them differently, maybe break them down, or maybe just take some of those APIs and make them API regret for Android only. So AndroidX Room library is a good example where originally this library was written to make it work against the SQLite that ships inside of the Android platform. But when you build a KMP library, you really want to bundle, like you want to ship the SQLite itself. And SQLite exposes different APIs than what the Android platform exposes for SQLite. And there's kind of a discrepancy. And so what we ended up doing is because of the way KMP works, you can actually have different APIs for different platforms. So we split out all of the Androidisms into the Android platform.
Yeah.
And so if you use it from like a common space, you don't actually get all of the Android specific things. But if you do need to jump into that layer, you can add an Android specific source set that uses those APIs there. So it's kind of like I guess I'd say layered approach on like how you kind of go about it.
Well, as someone who did iOS ages ago, I'll do my best to thank you so much for trying your best to not inflict context upon iOS developers. I'm sure they're very happy about that. I think this is absolutely fascinating. I think obviously like as platform and API designers, like literally everything I do is built on what you do. So I really appreciate it. If you're at all interested in, I don't know, like what you work on is built and how it works, please check out Alan Aurimas' talk. If people wanted to find you on the internet, where can they find you?
I'm on Reddit. My username is just my first and last name.
Okay.
And then I'm on Mastodon, so it's Aurimas at androiddev.social.
Beautiful. All right. Well, please check out that talk. And thank you guys so much for taking time to talk to me. And thank you all for joining. We'll see you on the next one.
Thanks so much.
Bye.